Please note that a lot of this document is extremely personal, but I was withholding this and feel like it is no longer necessary. Feel free to go at your own pace, there is no rush, I am very verbose, I am aware. There really isn't a TLDR for my silence for an entire year. Please also don't go after any of the people mentioned, as that's not the point. I just want to clarify my stance, my opinions, pink lol, and then leave this alone. No witch hunting. Solves nothing and does nothing. Why'd I leave map porting? The group. Squidalicious is dead and has been for a while. Fission is well and truly past the point of caring for anyone, to the point he literally cannot even face you all while telling you he's done. That last announcement was made by Fancy and Evan in his place, and he has not made a peep about it. My suspicion, after talking with another individual, is that he built himself validity of being leader, and he doesn't want out, because then he'd have to admit to himself it was a lust for power. Zelda Boy was in charge of a private model porting group on Discord, which I joined after the map porting group on Discord. Then we tossed ourselves into another map porting group, and then he made the Steam group at some point during this. But the major project that was on everyone's minds was the Square. Some people made really placeholder versions to buy time for the better version that was being made. But this project was tossed between individuals with no care or attention to the facets involved with it. Everyone was using the wrong tree 0 instead of tree 5, which anyone with some eyes can take a look at in the game and see it's different. Collision was seriously whack, and several details and aspects were missing or incomplete, such as all of the Octo expansion crap. None of the 6 rooms were included. They weren't even aware there's 6, they assumed 4. And there were floating Splatfest speakers in the normal version of the map. Zelda Boy was tossed the project after L Power, but his behavior and his attitude towards it are little more than a hot mess, both towards other people and towards the project, as he and I'd like to think everyone were just doing it for the clout. Since, everyone and their mother screamed for the Square down through the other end. Free internet popularity points, not, oh hey, here's a good port we should probably try to make while everyone's asking us. I had intended to do the Square originally. I had made assets, including my very first collision ever, and heck, I think even User did some bits, though I revised that and everything, because I was doing it at the same time. I completely redid this though. The collision I did redo was scaled down. I manually scale up my maps, thanks. And I included friggin' everything. To the Octo expansion stuff, to dynamic props, to Splatfest versions, including seasonals. Whoo, those were a pain. To rooms, to everything. I poured everything I had into it, to the point some days I just needed a break because working on it sometimes ended up tossing me into bugs, among other things. Like too many entities one day, next day the cube maps were too bright, next day the game started lagging, only because streams on Discord are like, haha, what, we're dying here. And I had to be concerned about performance, as well as animated textures, moderating the cube maps so everything didn't look like a mirror, applying the correct skybot. What did Zelda Boy do? Oh, I'm porting the sword over. How do I compile a source model without bones, since it's impossible? He meant sequences, which are animations, not bones. Jumping between 15 projects at once, nagging and insulting others, acting so high and mighty about having kicked me out after he ignored and belittled me and so many others so many goddamn times, I just didn't want to care. I don't want to be around this sad shell of a man who ports for clout. Here are the receipts borrowing personal information regarding the Splatfest thing. Link. Before this point, I had retrieved all the passcodes for a tool someone had made to dump BCAT, background content, asymmetric synchronized delivery and transmission, data, which for Splatoon 2 is Splatfest data. What typically gets sent over BCAT is dialogue, the announcement and winning losing dialogues for both teams. Included with the files are the colors both teams use and the neutral color, the panel texture for the booth, the shirt texture and the icon texture. I think this is something to do with the menu for each team. What also got sent over BCAT were the model files for each Shifty station. Their textures were in the game's files, but the actual models were distributed over BCAT and then shifted with each Splatfest. This was until the update when they were all downloaded into the game's files. We were using this tool for a while until Nintendo noticed, and then the tool stopped working. Some guy had made a tool for dumping BCAT data from the Switch itself. If you've read Oatmeal Dome's articles, hopefully you'll understand there are 3 software versions of Splatoon 2, and that's how regions work. 2 versions of the game are in English, 1 in Japanese, also some other languages depending which of the US and EU versions you have. You will only ever have one of these three versions regardless of where you actually live. I live in Australia, but our retailed version on the eShop and physically is the American version of the game. Anything that applies to America applies to us as well. This meant I had only access to one set of Splatfest data, so I needed to get the other two. In 2019, I had gotten the funds necessary for my birthday to obtain 2 other copies to dump the Splatfest teas, dialogue, colors included, panel textures, and the shifties, which at the time were exclusive to Splatfests. The Japanese fest, where they sponsored some baseball league thing in their Splatfest, where the shirts even got newer designs, however, took place way earlier than I expected it to, so I had to buy myself points to use on the Japanese eShop, make myself a new account, buy myself Splatoon 2 in Japan, I know what it's called, while I waited for the physical version of it and the European version to ship. Including exchange rate, that's well over $200 just for some stupid t-shirts. And this idiot decided to mention my name, Zilch. All the while he'll complain I was asking him to steal flexes, face posing, when I simply wanted him to enhance what had already been established from Enhanced Inklings 1. He was working on that, and let me tell you, they're little more than the in-game models with some minor skin enhancements to match the enhanced lings. That's it. That's all they were. When he has the gall to demand I'm so bad for stealing flexes because he can copyright what expressions your model's allowed to have when it's of a property you don't even own, yaha. When he'll be up my ass that I didn't do a collision model the way he demanded me for one because he clearly couldn't do it himself when this is a level of his quality. Even beyond that, how he acted towards me, belittling me any chance I got to express how much I hated the way he and certain other individuals acted with how dare I hated how much they uselessly spammed gifs around in their private groups, mocking and shaming the Splatoon community while they do nothing to improve it and actively defend people who literally had no idea what they were doing, backstabbing me multiple times after I tried to teach him lessons about sharing. A post I really hate from his end was when we were reminiscing about our past and when I was mentioning mine started with the DS and Wii, which would imply I have no means of knowing about anything prior to that, or that I have no interest in hacking those games or any games because of their status as casual consoles. I fixed an AR code for Nintendogs, okay? I've dumped my save files. My very hacking and data mining originated on the DS when, spoiler alert, everyone at my school had a Cyclo DS or equivalent and was using it to cheat. I was taught how to by a peer of mine who I'd been best friends with for years, and I'm pretty much in debt to her after springboarding to where I am now. So I will not take "you're not a normal gamer, you're just the casualist" from this man after all he's done to me. I knew from the outset of him receiving it, he wasn't going to finish it. He couldn't find it in him to actually spend time to do it because he wasn't doing it because he liked it. He likes other things, including harassing and backstabbing people apparently. But of the things he legitimately likes, maybe he should stick to instead of clout chasing anything he might find because of those free, temporary, short-term internet points. I've had many an unpleasant experience with individuals just like him who have no concept of understanding things around them beyond abusing their power for their own selfish gain, which Fission used as well, which is a regret that I live with now. I left map porting because as he has no concept of sharing, oh believe me, what he's sharing is to benefit him and not you, I won't share to those who don't care. And I left him because I don't want to be in a group run by a maniac. I don't have to be tied to any group to port what I want, and that isn't going to stop. But I want nothing to do with that fraud, and I've been meaning to leave for a while, just that it wasn't the right time. SFM differences and technicalities. When users stopped talking with me initially, I was contacted by John and Joseph the KP to join map porting. I had literally no other option then, so then I learned some things there. There, they told me the SFM version has a couple of things different from Gmod. SFM uses a different spawn point type, Gmod can use it too, but I prefer them being different. SFM collision is a convenience, not a necessity. Too many dynamic props lags the map. I recall while Flounder Heights was being made, I attempted compiling a version of the map with mostly static props, no collision, and with info player team spawn, the spawn point, and for some reason there were massive bugs all over the place preventing it from working. It was from that point John requested I hand over the assets I was using, and this was done all the way until Octo Valley. I had a thought in the back of my mind about the collision, but since such drastic changes were being made to maps behind the scenes mostly, I didn't know exactly what was going on. I didn't think to pursue it until a close friend of mine mentioned there was a command in SFM which allowed you to snap a model to collision. I believe I had provided my collision to the others when I gave them the blends and models, but I hadn't clarified how it works as it's a very tedious and complicated process. There's something I need to mention before I go further, and that's why my relationship with John pretty much stopped after Octo Valley. It wasn't a one-way relationship, nor did I really just care for him as the SFM person. We talked in the map group often, though since I'm so focused on the map project, I don't really often have much else to talk about. Since I have no means to discuss the stories I still can't put out yet, and I'm not self-deprecating enough to meme in a sarcastic manner about the Splatoon community, this is what started to drive a wedge between me and the others. Then the last few maps he put out on his own actually had severe problems which I attempted to help him on, only to be met with ignorance and arrogance. I recall finding out about no-cull not being a viable parameter to use in certain models in Gmod, which came because of an issue he had with Snapper Canal, where since the no-cull side is a projection, it can't receive light for some reason. For this reason, it's why I believe often stated recommendations on the internet about models removing doubles is actually not a fix-all button as what you might be led to believe. A model's normal is where that face or faces are facing. That's where they receive light from a flashlight or a lamp or what have you. I only found this out after he had these issues with Snapper though, to where they couldn't be fixed immediately. He was also missing props there and in Macromart, which I let him know of and searched for him within my own dumps. Tentakiel is where things began to sever though. He had been working on it for a while, like months, so I didn't know exactly what was going on. It's worth noting in the map group, I'm pretty much the only person porting to Gmod, then going to SFM, rather than the other way around. I've often heard stories where people often believe Gmod is harder than SFM, and I don't really want to judge based on my experience, but making collision and then making it work usually isn't hard, if you're aware of what can be done. Oftentimes, I was misconstrued. Da Vinci's Reef, partially Wahoo World, and this also began to create issues. Tentakiel releases, so I decided to go into it. They never gave it to me to test beyond an early version with no collision, so I presume they tested themselves, which, sure, but if you lack experience, I'm of the opinion it's not a very good idea. This is why I don't test SFM myself, because I cannot use it very well. And then I find out something very disastrous. Every single prop in the map is set to being dynamic. As you technically should, but the way we make collisions is different. I attach collisions to props, and then turn those props into statics. There is a bug in Source, both programs, where prop static will often compile and the model will be pitch black. You can add Fong1 to the VMT, but this makes it much brighter than if it were a prop dynamic for some reason, and it can be jarring. I don't know any fix beyond turning the prop into a dynamic. This is why I have 20 minutes of playtime on TF2. That was me frozen on the title screen. While I attempted a fix someone mentioned, that didn't work anyway. I put the map in Gmod to check. Haha, still pitch black. And since I used TF2's hammer out of recommendation from L-Power, that's what happened. So this is why props without collision are dynamic in my maps. In Gmod, it doesn't even make much of a difference. Map doesn't appear to lag all that much. But apparently, according to this lot, it did do that in SFM. Something else I'm often criticized for by them and by some others is the lack of immersion. My collision is made in a manner that doesn't take into account materials of individual floor pieces. This is done on purpose since they're made for posing in, not a ported version of the game, because that's kinda impossible. It would also make the collision more complicated, which I don't want to risk at the level it's at, where it may already lag in some instances without it, and making more convex pieces than every single piece is immersive would be problematic. Another thing is that if I miss an area that should have a different type of collision, or someone doesn't like how I collisioned something, one can easily point to the area in question and I can get right to it. An issue with Flounder Heights at the moment, due to how users sorted my collision, is that everything is glomped into 3 collision models, and because of that it's impossible to discern individual pieces if anyone is dissatisfied with that collision in any way. This was why making the hallway in the center was very difficult after it had been uploaded as a cube, and also why removing the general boxes is a pain because it's attached to models that are basically overlapping one another. The amount of collision models would drastically increase, and some maps do not have that many props to attach the collision to, and the probability that things can overlap and become impossible to edit becomes much higher if you make that a thing. Another thing, which I've often specified in the descriptions, is I am not porting these maps for any reason other than posing scenery for videos, comics, posters, etc. This is why I will not add nodes to the maps. They are ported playsets, functionally anyway. I'm not looking to create an experience. I try to make it as functional as possible, but the Gmod player is not a cephalopod in the 12,000 year future of Splatoon, and so the geometry is not made in accordance with that. It is ported from a video game, and the developers created these with their video game in mind, not ours. I technically shouldn't even be doing any of this. This is why I linked the source files in my link of my Twitter rules, kinda changed but mostly the same. If you want to make drastic changes to include ranked versions, dynamic flooring, and that you know how, go right ahead, but I am not doing that in my releases. I'm releasing them for posing scenery purposes. They are basically playsets to pose Inklings and Octolings mostly, but also anything else if you want. I will provide a link to the source elsewhere in my new group soon, but keep in mind the above. Something to know about dynamic props is they can be altered. They can be colored, they can be removed. Every single part of the floor in Tentakill Outpost was dynamic. You could literally go in and remove every single part of the floor with no regard for how the floor would look if you removed it. The developers also did a lot of tricks to create the environments they wanted. There'd be culling all over the place. The tool gun can spawn objects as well as remove them. You could submaterial the Inkling and instead be aiming at the floor. You could remove the Inkling, but instead aim for the floor, and since it's part of the BSP or the map, you wouldn't be able to Control Z it back unless you were to reset everything. Yes, there's a command to clean the map. This is what I'm referring to, as well as restarting the game. If you had half a scene built and then you removed the floor, congratulations. Now that person has to build everything again. The night version also used the incorrect skybox, and he was missing the dummies I'd repeatedly sent him and told him about. Such major faults would have been noticed before they went up had you gotten someone with experience to test your map. When I went in to remind him that he clearly had not done enough testing, he kept presuming it not a big deal, and I quote, "You have to be really dumb to delete part of the map on accident." Link. When the tool gun can be used to remove things extremely quickly. Yes, I'm sure it's entirely on the fault of your users. You didn't set up the map properly, so then you didn't make them have to waste time over your own incompetence. What also didn't help was when he threatened deleting the maps that had been ported over a number of children acting extremely immature, faking suicides for attention of all sorts, and then having to passive-aggressively say, "Oh, I was only pretending, Lamau," when people actually show concern, including pretending I wasn't going to see that when these were maps I wanted ported as well, and I would be furious if he removed them over a small number of children being very immature, unrelated to the add-on itself. We lost contact, and then I find out he puts Departure, the area you wake up in Octo Expansion, its internal name is Departure and has never been officially stated, so I just call it Departure, up because someone gave him collision for it. But it's actually really disgusting, the quality of the map in question. The area is underground, yet he gives it day and night versions. The night version in question isn't even usable because you can't see anything. There's no HDR compiled with the map, So everything's full bright. Even with HDR, it doesn't look spectacular, but without it, it looks 10 times worse. He used the incorrect cube maps in the map models. There's incorrect UVs all over the place, and Z flickering apparently on the posters in the train. This is what I mean, where to some people over the last few months, my description has basically been, he stopped caring. He barely did with Tentakiel, and did not at all with Departure. Tentakiel at least got fixed after Octo, who made the collision, eventually fixed the map, so you weren't destroying the floor, and now you can somewhat use it. But Departure has no excuse, and I am appalled. It was shortly after this we blocked one another. It was shortly after this he joined Zelda Boy, importing from Ninjawa, which I'm not surprised at in the slightest. They definitely want that clout after the art style and lore to some extent is basically bootlegged Splatoon, which they got the taste of fame from already. I had to continue looking onward. I asked Octo, but he couldn't get anything to work. So I had no choice but to ask user under the condition the square is the only thing ported. What? You're quitting? No, please, I shall continue to explain. User and I really struggle with maps. The way I make them is very complicated. So complicated it can get tedious. This is really what drove progress of the square to a screeching halt. It would have been out earlier, but if I release the Gmod version first, people will ask for an SFM version, and I can't answer those people properly. I attempted to use it with a tutorial, but it didn't work. I couldn't pose an Inkling period. There's also a number of problems with maps as they stand. My collision does work in SFM with no edits, but the SFM workshop doesn't accept PHY files, and so they need to be in a separate download or packed inside the map file. Since John and I have no contact, and even when we did, he never asked for the collision, and as I've learned, none of the people in the map group's maps, are even compatible with the command to snap the collision because they don't know how to make collision in the way I've done it. I would want the maps I've put up for the SFMN to have my collision, both work, but they need to be reconverted. I don't know what John did, and I have no access to those models. Why do I use TF2's hammer? Gmod's got a lot of additions, but everything's already set up, and HDR compiling became a pain in the butt when it didn't work in the Gmod hammer, which they said for me to use TF2's because it worked. There's a different texture in Gmod that provides HDR, which I'm thinking of testing, but another convenience is that since I don't use TF2, putting models in that directory isn't even an inconvenience, so it makes it easier to sort if my work files aren't in the same location as all of my play files, if that makes any sense. I recall often stated recommendations to use Alien Swarm's hammer. L-Power even said it to me, SFM was Alien Swarm and Gmod was TF2, because source! Beyond the fact that it didn't even work when I ported the square from scratch for Gmod in the Alien Swarm hammer, that recommendation comes into question when I recall L-Power's unpreparedness when it came to listening to me when I warned him the hat room was extremely intense. So intense, he quit the project and tossed it over to Zelda Boy, who proceeded to mishandle it even further. It's not the only instance either. Kelpdome uses Splatoon 1's textures because he couldn't brighten the textures on whatever script he was using that darkened them on export. Also, that source shows things in-game as way brighter than whatever the heck the texture might have you think. Take a look at the seasonal skies. If I brightened the colors any further, you'd be in the Sonic Generations void. Moray Towers is missing the windsocks and several other contextual props. He literally just ported the FLD from the second game, which you technically shouldn't do. He was also doing Lost Outpost, but that fell to the back, and when he quit the square, that also fell down the rabbit hole too. Good thing I already liked that map anyway, and had already basically made everything except collision. Good thing the layout isn't really very complicated anyway. User proceeded to use TF2's hammer then for SFM since there were similarities between same spawn point, game mode uses TF2 characters. This is a problem for me though. I'd have to have two sets of add-ons for the individual differences that are required. It's also for this reason that, to those who I talked to about developing SFM versions, is why I didn't want to hold the SFM files in that directory as well, as they would conflict with the Gmod versions, and let's say in terms of computer space, I'm a bit of a hoarder. While it's not extreme, Having two versions of tons of files, never mind how many renditions would need to exist. I like to keep developer versions so then I can upload those so people can modify them, as well as a version for myself as backup, would get a bit problematic and overwhelming on myself as well. Like for instance, I gave my Gmod square to the person who asked me to look into the collision originally, and it worked. You had to enable other entities, but the map worked, collision and even performance-wise. I thought I should pursue a proper SFM port anyway, just to be on the safe side, especially since I attempted to fix the long-standing problem of the daytime skybox just plain not working in Blackbelly Skate Park SFM. My night one worked perfectly fine though, Lamau, and it still didn't work. Why was I quiet for a year while I made the square? So I'm at the end now. The square's out. Yippee-hi-yay. Can you explain why you were silent for so long? Right, so beginning of 2020 was a wild ride. I was at the stage of scale testing several of the maps that basically were in the stage to actually get ported over. Yes, again. Originally I did do a bunch of rough scale tests, but this was using the T-Post inkling I'd received from a blend Fission had. With Collision, I can more easily match my in-game screenshots, and therefore this is the beginning of the actual porting process, since several things need to be considered with each map, like fizz constraints and textures at the same time. But while I was working on that part of converting the maps, several things happened. The workshop first got an update in January to increase the amount of space an add-on can take from 200 megabytes to 2 gigabytes. That's massive. Still not enough to upload Kit's pack, that's over 10 gigabytes, haha, fudge me. But quite literally, both my clothes packs and pack 3 from DeviantArt can be merged into one add-on. All the maps with texture packs can be fused. Unfortunately, that becomes a giant mess when I begin to talk about what happens after. February is where things get really bad. I can't stay in map porting because my ear problem from mid-January is still bothering me, and the square becomes actually a problem. Like, actually a problem literally. Decisions begin being made that are of detriment to everyone with it. So for the sake of not talking about it, I talk about it vaguely for a while so then I can not trip the wire when things could be better. I couldn't talk about the square because I was helping keep up the point for someone else, because both of us had an issue, actually, scratch that, many issues, with the way the original Square project was tossed around and run. It ties back around into the Discord groups, where several of the members revealed over time they clearly didn't want to port maps. They just wanted to join the clout chain because many of them refused to take basic help or discuss anything. Decisions were made with so many maps that I cannot fathom, like how the reef has unremovable bunkers. Da Vinci, I was criticizing myself while telling you that. Or how spawning grounds is a literal mess. The float objects don't have the right UVs, basket is not removable, and I believe it's a bit too big. I do plan to redo spawning grounds since for some reason I can't decompile the thing to get to the model to fix the float UVs, something I actually gave Pieface a tutorial on how to fix, and they said they'd put in the final build. The square suffered the worst from this. Such terrible decisions were made on the collision end, on including props. All of them were using the wrong tree model. Nobody included the rooms. The tutorial and shooting range didn't include any extra props, with no consideration for how they are set up in-game even. The animated screens were given the wrong shaders. I could go on and on about how it was a literal mess. Not to mention the behind the scenes, tossed between 3 people because not one of them actually understood they were making a map and not their big walk to fame as they'd hoped it'd be. It's a very complicated affair making a map. A lot of factors have to come into play. There's even things I leave out. But it's so clear from the way many of them handled it, they were not doing it because they wanted to port the square. They did it because they wanted the attention and fame they'd receive from doing something as massive as it, or else they'd have listened after I warned them of several things. Like how the collision was bad in a lot of places, how there were 6 rooms, not 4. Yes, the Grisco and showrooms are actually fully modeled and aren't just called room. how the hat room loads with 200 objects originally. This got chopped way down after Gmod freaked out about that, by the way. This isn't counting the variations in the Splatfest versions, which was probably the most difficult part due to being unable to have in-game reference, and YouTube compression kills any sort of accuracy you could have, beyond source just being a pain. If I put out too much attention for something that technically wasn't mine to talk about and start, tripping the wire would cause a frenzy. I'm aware someone else made a square and I'm not the first, but people were under the impression there was a big square project being tossed around because of what the others proudly and boldly proclaimed. It was a thing, but when I looked at it in February 2020, it was bad. You wouldn't have wanted it. I'd already had scraps, though I built it from scratch because I used very bad methods to rip things back when I ripped them originally, so everything was redone for this. It's also because of this that I didn't want to work on anything else either. Just like the Plaza and Octo Valley to an extent, people waited years for a good Inkopolis square. If I sidetracked with my very long mostly Splatoon 1 project, it would take longer to get back to the thing I know many people care about. That isn't to say nobody cares about Splatoon 1 or I wouldn't even bother at all. Since I wasn't the first to mention the square, I wanted to just come out with the release and explain myself later. Now then, since I solely worked on the square for so long, don't think it didn't do a number on me either. I'm fine, but it took a lot of time and effort. I also don't like being secretive about these things. I liked to quip on Twitter about it. That which I can no longer do because I no longer feel safe on Twitter. Progress won't stop altogether. I don't think I'd like it if I stopped forever, but I don't want to solely focus on one map. As for the moment, I want to attempt to go back to working on the other maps to finish them. I'll mention them as I please, though I'll be a little slower now that the map is finished. When you are considering a hub, you have to take a lot of things into consideration to include everything appropriate to make it as accurate as possible. Please don't take on maps like the Plaza or the Square unless you seriously know what you are doing. The hubs in particular have hundreds of assets and several factors in them, such as dynamic props and things that load in and out depending on specific circumstances, e.g. the colorable hats follow your Team B color in the pairing in the game, so if you match your Team B, no one wants a crappy hub. Don't get way too crazy with things either. Don't try to include inappropriate things. I know this sounds a bit awkward, but the old one was considering dancing NPCs in the Splatfest one. I know in the name of preservation that sounds cool, but think about that. You'd have to remove them every single time you load the stage. And why did we draw the line at just Pearl and Marina? Why not include all of them? No, of course that makes no sense. So why any of them? We have the ragdolls. If people want to make them dance, they can do that themselves. I'll try to mention more, but as I've also not been liking Twitter for other reasons, I'm not in the position to be tweeting all the time. Thus, I left because I no longer feel safe, treating it like DA in the sense the account will remain, but I no longer use it. Now that that's through, I'm set to continue the project hopefully now at my pace, instead of having to keep people worried. One other thing that is getting a tad concerning is the lack of being able to do anything for SFM. The Square had a lot of issues near the end because I'm purely focusing on the Gmod versions right now, since that's my field of knowledge. I've tried using SFM, but I'm no good at it, and this was with tutorials. I cannot use it like a regular user would, let alone making a map for it. I only know very small piecemeal things about it. Around the endpoint of when absolutely everything for the Gmod version was completed, the SFM version not working and not being able to be made really threw a wrench into everything. And I like to release both versions at the same time to prevent people asking for one or the other, as they're very deeply connected. Release one version and people will demand you for the other, I have learned. And I'm purely a Gmod person. everything I know is relevant for making a map for Gmod. So that's really going to have to be looked into. I couldn't be public with the square for the reasons mentioned above, so it took longer than anticipated, and I'm sorry, but I have my reasons. Another small thing is I'm going to have to merge the texture packs for everything, though in doing so I noticed someone asking to include the colors on the Kitsune and Tanuki in the plaza. I do not have access to the SFM version, so I cannot exactly provide anything to fix that there. However, I can provide a fix to the Gmod version, and I can even add functionality to it, but I have to put forward 2 ways this can be done. The map's been out for a year, so it's likely people have considered it fine to make save states of it. This is why I'm putting forward 2 methods, as one takes into consideration those save states, but reduces the functionality I'd like to give to it, and the other doesn't, but providing the functionality is much easier. I'm thinking of giving colorable functionality to the Kitsune and the Tanuki. This would be extremely easy to do in either instance, but there are some caveats to it. Right now, both of those props are prop dynamic, they just have no collision. I can provide them basic collision and export them with it, and then such colorable functionality would be tied to the TF2 Painter tool. However, this would break compatibility with your save states because the model would have to be recompiled with collision, and then I would have to modify the map so then you aren't flinging them all over the place. In case you don't know, their undersides aren't rendered, which would break every single save state. There's a simpler method, though editing would be more obtuse, in that I could simply provide the texture edit that would be required to the models as they are, and you could change the color by extracting the add-on and going to the VMT and changing the RGB value, but you would only be able to do that, as since they don't have collision, the TF2 Painter tool wouldn't be able to hit them, and thus they wouldn't be very accessible. This would be done while I'm merging the texture packs, which for everything else wouldn't affect your save states at all. In fact, you'd simply be using the updated add-on the same way you've used both add-ons, only you're using one add-on instead of 2. I'll be updating it shortly, however, I want to hear back about the plaza since I'm not sure how to proceed with this update. There's a poll which surmises it below. I will leave the original add-ons up for the texture pack for a little while after I apply the update, but they will not be up forever. There's no point. Those files will be merged with the original map. They won't change directories or anything, so your save states aren't going to die unless you vote for the Plaza hard change, but again that's for 2 models, simply by installing one add-on instead of 2 as it was originally meant to be and not split up because no one was expecting huge maps or anything. So don't expect the texture pack add-ons to remain up forever. I don't need to make SFM versions of the other maps I'm working on immediately yet. There are a few others I need to pick up to make proper Gmod versions of them, either out of my own interest or because I want them to be better, Spawning Grounds, Lost Outpost, and Departure being some of these. And thus I have a very long road making collision and scale testing a large number of maps. I don't want to release just the Gmod versions because making SFM versions is very confusing for the moment, and drove a truck between me and other people again, which I didn't want to have to do. No, really. But I was met with no other choice since I had to be quiet about the square, especially since some other people know there are other versions and I didn't want to devalue them until I made absolutely sure I wasn't just making a hoax for people to get excited over. But eventually in the future, all of that will be completed, and I do not know the specifics for SFM. You need a separate download or to be packed on the file to make collisions work. Other entities is for enabling dynamic props, which need to be packed into the map because the uploader doesn't like them either. But I don't know the specifics beyond that to make props work without them disappearing, where dynamic props work and where they don't, or anything about how to ensure they're usable in SFM the way they are in Gmod. I don't want to use the same hammer for making both versions, as that didn't work originally, still doesn't work in some cases, and is overall confusing since I'm doing the Gmod versions. So I ask, if anyone can port to SFM the maps so then they can release at the same time so no one is worrying where the other is, which is very often a thing. So many maps just come out on SFM because many people think easy first. I want to avoid that with Gmod to prevent disappointment, please contact me. The way I make maps is very unorthodox to the way pretty much everyone else is doing it. It's evident in so much of the creation process. It can get tedious and complicated. It's not for fame, it's so then people can enjoy things all together. Even I get that way when a map or even a model sometimes comes out for SFM and not Gmod. I'm human too.